Hello guys, I'm glad you are here tonight. Before we dive into this long journey through history, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered all across the world, lying down in different rooms, different cities, listening to the same quiet story. Maybe you are in America, maybe in Europe, maybe somewhere in Asia, maybe it is the middle of the night, maybe it is early morning. Wherever you are, just settle in because this story is going to take you deep into a time that feels both far away and strangely close. The years when the world was at war, and when millions of ordinary Americans had to figure out what it really meant to live through it. To imagine what it was like, you have to picture not just the battlefield, but the kitchens and the small houses, the city streets and the little country towns, because for every soldier who marched across Europe or the Pacific, there were 10 more people back home, rationing sugar and gasoline, standing in line for coffee, saving bits of string and paper, and wondering if their sons or brothers would ever return. America in the 1940s was a place where optimism and fear lived side by side, where swing music played on the radio while casualty lists filled the newspapers. It was a time when families gathered around the living room radio, listening to President Roosevelt's calm voice, and when children played war in the streets with wooden rifles, not fully realizing how real that war was for so many. If you were an American then, you felt the war everywhere, even if you never left your hometown. You tasted it in your food because butter was rationed and you had to use margarine dyed with a little yellow packet to make it look right. You saw it in shop windows, where posters reminded you to buy war bonds or told you that careless talk could cost lives. You felt it in the way your neighbors looked at each other, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with solidarity. Everyone was expected to contribute, whether by knitting socks for soldiers, collecting scrap metal, or growing vegetables in victory gardens. There was a constant hum of sacrifice, but also pride in doing something together. For young men, the draft notice could arrive at any time. Imagine opening an envelope and seeing that letter beginning with "Greetings." That single word could change the entire course of your life. Many of those who were drafted had never left their hometown before, had never traveled farther than the next county, and suddenly they were being sent to training camps in strange states, and later across oceans to places they had only ever seen on maps. They were often barely out of high school, carrying with them the smell of their mother's cooking and the memory of the last dance they went to, suddenly thrust into a world of discipline, mud, and danger. And yet, it wasn't just about soldiers. Women were called to work in ways they had never been before. Think of a young woman who once thought her life would be defined by running a household, suddenly standing on a factory floor, wearing coveralls and safety goggles, learning to rivet metal plates for airplanes. She might come home with grease under her nails, her hands rough from tools, and yet there was pride in that too, because she knew she was part of something bigger than herself. At the same time, she might also worry about her husband or brother overseas, reading every letter twice, 3 times until the paper grew soft from folding and unfolding. Children grew up faster. A boy might deliver newspapers and see headlines about battles in places like North Africa, Sicily, or the Solomon Islands, names that sounded exotic and terrifying at once. A girl might stand in line with her mother, holding ration coupons, and learn that you couldn't always buy what you wanted, that patience and thrift had become part of everyday life. They learned to make do, to reuse, to repair. Even small pleasures like candy or chewing gum were harder to find, and so when you got them, they felt almost magical. Entertainment mattered more than ever. Movies played a huge role because when you sat down in a dark theater and the newsreel flickered on the screen, you could see grainy black and white footage of the war. Tanks rolling, ships firing, troops advancing, and then the feature film might carry you away for a few hours into a world of comedy, romance, or adventure. It was an escape, but also a reminder because even Hollywood was full of war themes. Stars appeared in uniform, and stories were told about sacrifice and duty. Music, too, was a lifeline. Big bands played songs that lifted spirits, and soldiers overseas listened to the same tunes on scratchy records, a little thread connecting them back to home. There was fear, yes, but there was also determination. People talked about how we're all in this together. And that spirit, even if it sometimes cracked under the weight of loss, carried the country forward. For Americans, World War II was not just a conflict fought abroad. It was a total experience that reached into kitchens, factories, schools, farms, and churches. To be an American in those years was to feel the world pressing in on you, demanding something, and shaping who you were in ways that would last long after the war was over. And so, as we begin this story, imagine yourself there. In a small town or a big city, maybe a farm in the Midwest, maybe a crowded street in New York, maybe a quiet house in the South. Imagine the radio humming in the corner, the windows darkened for a blackout drill, the taste of coffee made weaker because you had to stretch it out, the sound of footsteps on the porch as the mailman comes with letters that could bring either joy or heartbreak. That was the texture of life, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. And it is from that place that we will begin our long journey through what it truly meant to be an American in the Second World War. Daily life during those years often felt like living with one foot in the ordinary and one foot in something larger, something that seemed to hang over every conversation. Imagine walking into a diner on a cold morning in 1943. The coffee is weaker than you remember from just a few years earlier because real coffee is rationed and sometimes you are drinking chicory instead. The sugar is scarce, and the waitress may give you a smaller portion than before, but the jukebox is still playing, maybe a Glenn Miller tune, and for a few moments the world outside feels distant. Men in uniform sit at the counter beside workers in plain clothes, and there is an understanding that everyone is carrying a piece of the same burden. In factories, the air was filled with the clang of metal and the smell of oil. Women tied their hair back with scarves so it wouldn't get caught in machines. Posters reminded everyone of safety, productivity, and patriotism. The pace was relentless, but paychecks mattered, and for many families it was the first time they had extra money in their pockets. Still, there was little to buy. New cars weren't being made. Rubber was too precious to waste on frivolous tires, and silk stockings had vanished because the material was used for parachutes. People learned to patch and mend, to wear things longer than before, to see luxury in something as simple as a fresh loaf of bread. On farms, life carried its own challenges. Farmers were asked to produce more, because the nation had to feed not only itself but also the military and even allies overseas. Young men left for the war, and so older men, women, and even children had to take up more work in the fields. Tractors rattled across wide plains, barns stored crops in larger quantities, and sometimes German prisoners of war were sent to help with the harvest. A strange and unsettling reminder that the conflict was not always far away. Communication was slow, and that shaped the rhythm of emotions. Letters from soldiers could take weeks to arrive, and by the time a family read about one moment, the soldier was already somewhere else entirely. Telegrams carried the heaviest weight, because when one arrived, everyone held their breath. Could bring the worst news imaginable. That dread lived quietly in households, always present, always unspoken. Yet when letters came filled with jokes, stories of camp life, or little drawings, families clung to them, sometimes reading them aloud around the dinner table as if the absent son or husband were speaking right there with them. Entertainment became a form of comfort and escape. Radio programs like The Shadow or Fibber McGee and Molly gave people laughter at the end of long days, and everyone leaned closer to the radio during major announcements. Music was everywhere. Jazz bands, crooners, and swing records spun on turntables, and people danced in community halls, pretending for a night that the war wasn't raging. Soldiers far away received care packages with small phonograph records or song sheets, and they sang along with the same words their sweethearts back home were humming. There was also a steady stream of newsreels and propaganda films. The government wanted Americans to feel united and motivated. Posters showed strong men, determined women, and slogans like "Loose lips sink ships." Children collected scrap metal and rubber in drives, proudly contributing their small part. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards, and people prided themselves on feeding their families from their own soil. Even school lessons included war themes, maps of Europe, geography of the Pacific, arithmetic problems involving war production. The war seeped into every subject. There were also shadows, of course. Not every American experienced the war in the same way. African American soldiers fought bravely abroad but returned to a country where segregation still ruled. Japanese American families were uprooted from their homes on the West Coast and placed into internment camps, guarded by barbed wire and armed soldiers, even though many of their sons fought in the very army that had ordered their families removed. These contradictions hung heavy, though not everyone acknowledged them at the time. Still, day to day, people clung to rituals that gave them normalcy. Sunday dinners, church gatherings, small-town parades to send off young men, baseball games that reminded people life went on. In 1943, the St. Louis Cardinals won the World Series, and though many players were away in the service, the games lifted spirits. President Roosevelt even made a point of encouraging baseball to continue, saying it gave Americans something to hold on to. If you imagine yourself as a young man in training, the picture shifts. You wake before dawn to the sound of whistles and shouting, the barracks smell of sweat, wool, and damp boots. You march in formation, you crawl through mud, you clean your rifle until it gleams. Meals are eaten quickly in crowded mess halls, eggs, bread, sometimes powdered milk. Letters are read under dim lights, tucked into pockets as talismans. There is little privacy, but bonds grow quickly, because everyone knows they may depend on each other in moments of danger. And then there is the ocean, the ships carrying thousands across waters filled with submarines. Imagine standing on the deck at night, staring into black waves, not knowing if beneath them an enemy lurks. The air is cold, salty, and filled with the low hum of engines. Some men sing softly, some smoke in silence, some pray. Crossing the ocean meant crossing into a new life, into war zones, into lands where destruction was no longer just on a radio broadcast but directly in front of you. For those who stayed home, the rhythm of waiting defined everything. Women looked at empty chairs at the table. Children drew pictures for fathers they hadn't seen in months. Communities gathered for bond rallies, concerts, and blood drives, always aware that the names of neighbors could appear in the casualty lists printed in the paper. There was joy when letters arrived, joy when a familiar face came walking down the street in uniform, joy when news hinted that the war might someday turn in their favor. Through all of this, being an American in the Second World War meant carrying both hope and heaviness together. It was learning to celebrate small victories, like a birthday cake baked with fewer eggs but just as much love, while carrying the weight of global battles that stretched across continents. It was learning to endure uncertainty, to laugh when laughter seemed impossible, to keep going when the future was unclear. And above all, it was discovering how ordinary lives could be shaped by extraordinary times, in ways no one could ever forget. When you think about the American soldier stepping onto foreign soil for the first time, you have to imagine the mix of awe and dread that colored every moment. Many of these young men had never been farther than the county fair or the neighboring town, and suddenly they were in England, in France, in Italy, or on islands scattered across the Pacific. The streets smelled different, the languages sounded strange, the food tasted unfamiliar. Soldiers wrote home about cobblestone roads, about villagers who waved at convoys, about fields that seemed older than anything they had known in the United States. The world opened wide, but it opened in the shadow of war, with bombed-out buildings and blackened ruins standing as reminders that life was fragile. England was often the first stop for American troops, and the contrast struck them immediately. British towns had endured years of bombing, and windows were crisscrossed with tape to prevent shattering. Streets were dim during blackouts, and rationing was even harsher than in the States. Still, the British welcomed the Americans, sometimes warmly, sometimes with suspicion. GIs were known for their friendliness, their chewing gum, their cigarettes, their confident swagger. They brought swing music to dance halls, and suddenly British girls were learning jitterbug steps while men in uniform grinned and clapped along. But there was also tension. Locals sometimes said the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and overhere. Yet friendships formed, romances blossomed, and countless marriages between American soldiers and British women would eventually reshape lives forever. Food was always a subject of conversation. Soldiers missed hamburgers, milkshakes, and coffee that wasn't weak or bitter. They found themselves eating rations that came in little tins, Spam, powdered eggs, hard biscuits. C rations and K rations became familiar, each pack a mixture of necessity and disappointment. Still, when hunger struck after hours of marching or fighting, those same rations tasted like survival. Cigarettes became almost like currency, passed around in trenches, traded for favors, shared between strangers who became friends in the dark. Combat itself was another world, one that no amount of training could truly prepare them for. Imagine the cold of a European winter seeping through boots, the mud sucking at every step, the thunder of artillery shaking the ground beneath you. Imagine crouching in a foxhole, helmet pulled low, heart hammering as the sky flashes with gunfire. Letters home could never capture that fully. They softened the details, because who wanted to tell a mother about the fear that came with every sunrise? But among themselves, soldiers knew. They leaned on each other, cracked jokes in the worst moments, gave nicknames, swapped stories of high school baseball games or dances, clinging to the memory of a world that seemed very far away. Back home, those memories were being built in different ways. Women juggled jobs and households, often working long shifts in factories before returning home to cook, clean, and care for children. They grew vegetables in the backyard, saved bacon grease to be reused, and patched clothes until the fabric grew thin. Children collected tin cans, newspapers, and rubber for recycling drives. Even teenagers learned to shoulder responsibility, running errands, looking after younger siblings, or filling in on farms and businesses left short of manpower. The line between childhood and adulthood blurred quickly, and yet, amid all this responsibility, people still found ways to laugh. Board games, community dances, small-town fairs continued, though smaller and more restrained. On warm evenings, families might sit on porches, sipping weak lemonade, listening to the distant hum of trains, and talking about what they would do after the war. Plans for trips, for new houses, for reunions kept spirits alive. Everyone wanted to believe in after. News traveled slower than now, but when victories came, like the landings in North Africa, the liberation of towns in Italy, or the hard-fought beaches of Normandy, cheers rose in movie theaters, church bells rang in small towns, and neighbors gathered to celebrate. Each victory felt personal, like a step toward bringing loved ones home. But each loss felt personal too, because in a country where communities were close, the name of a fallen soldier was often someone's neighbor, someone's friend, someone's son. The experience was not just about war, it was about identity. Being American in those years meant more than nationality. It meant a shared mission, a shared endurance. Immigrants who had arrived only a few years before found themselves serving alongside men whose families had been in the United States for generations. Unity was preached constantly, even as tensions simmered beneath the surface. Still, the image of collective sacrifice, of everyone doing their part, was powerful enough to carry millions through the hardest years. Even in the darkest moments, little details stood out. Soldiers remembered the smell of fresh bread when they passed through liberated villages. They remembered children smiling shyly when offered a piece of gum. They remembered the sound of American jazz playing from makeshift gramophones in tents pitched on muddy fields. These small fragments of life, ordinary and human, became anchors that reminded them why they endured. For those back home, every knock on the door was a moment of holding breath. Sometimes it was just a neighbor, sometimes the postman with a letter, but always there was the shadow of possibility, that dreaded telegram. Families lived in a state of suspended emotion, trying to live normal days while carrying unspoken fear. Mothers prayed in kitchens, fathers buried themselves in work, siblings argued and played as if everything were normal. But always there was that thought, that hope, that question. To be American in World War II was to live with contradictions. Scarcity and abundance, fear and hope, loss and love. It was to write letters under dim light, to dance to music that tried to drown out sorrow, to believe in a better tomorrow even when today was filled with uncertainty. And as the war dragged on, year after year, the weight of those contradictions grew heavier, even as the determination to see it through only deepened. As the months turned into years, the war reshaped every rhythm of life, both for those who wore the uniform and for those who kept the home fires burning. On the battlefronts of Europe, American soldiers found themselves moving through landscapes scarred by destruction. Villages reduced to rubble, forests torn apart by shellfire, roads lined with burned-out vehicles. They trudged forward with packs heavy on their backs, rifles slung over their shoulders, and an exhaustion that sank into their bones. Sleep came in stolen moments, sometimes on the cold ground, sometimes propped against sandbags, sometimes not at all when the shells rained through the night. The weight of combat was not just physical but emotional. Men who had once been carefree high school students now learned the sound of incoming artillery, the smell of cordite, the sight of friends falling beside them. They spoke in hushed tones about luck, about fate, about how one small movement could mean survival or death. Yet alongside fear, there was resilience. Soldiers shared stories, swapped jokes, and found strange comfort in rituals. Lighting a cigarette at the same time each evening, writing a few lines in a pocket notebook, humming a tune that reminded them of home. These habits gave structure to chaos, little anchors in a world that seemed determined to unravel. The Pacific Theater brought challenges that felt entirely different. Instead of the cold and mud of Europe, there was heat, humidity, and jungle so dense that every step seemed like a battle against nature itself. Soldiers sweated through uniforms that never truly dried, swatted at clouds of mosquitoes, and lived with the constant possibility of ambush. Tropical diseases lurked everywhere: malaria, dysentery, dengue fever. Rations spoiled quickly in the heat, and fresh food was rare. Yet even in these conditions, men found ways to adapt, carving paths through the undergrowth, stringing hammocks between trees, learning to recognize the difference between the rustle of the wind and the movement of an enemy patrol. Meanwhile, in American towns and cities, the war years continued to test patience and ingenuity. Women grew adept at stretching meals, substituting corn syrup for sugar, using powdered milk for baking, turning leftovers into casseroles. Families shared recipes in newspapers under headlines like "Cooking Without Butter." Clothing was altered and re-altered. Children wore hand-me-downs until seams gave way, and shoes were patched again and again. But pride came from making do. People talked about their victory cakes and their victory stews, dishes made with less but eaten with the satisfaction of contributing to something greater. Communities also discovered new roles for women beyond the factory floor. They served as air raid wardens, patrolling neighborhoods to ensure blackout curtains were properly drawn. They volunteered at USO clubs, providing soldiers on leave with coffee, sandwiches, and a sense of home. They rolled bandages, organized blood drives, and wrote thousands of letters to servicemen. The phrase "Rosie the Riveter" became a symbol, but behind the posters were millions of real women whose hands ached from long hours, whose backs bent under fatigue, and who nevertheless carried on. Children grew up quickly. Boy Scouts collected scrap, Girl Scouts sewed clothing, and schools organized war bond drives. A child might drop pennies into a jar and feel proud that their small savings were helping buy a plane or a tank. Play often reflected the times. Kids pretended to be soldiers storming an imaginary hill, or sailors defending a cardboard battleship in the backyard. War was in their games because it was in the air they breathed, shaping how they understood the world. And yet, life continued in strange pockets of normalcy. Couples still fell in love, still courted, still married quickly before a husband was shipped overseas. Weddings were sometimes simple affairs, hurried and modest, but they carried a weight that few peacetime ceremonies could match. Every kiss, every promise was magnified by the uncertainty of tomorrow. Babies were born while fathers fought oceans away, and photographs were mailed across continents. Tiny faces pressed into envelopes, reminders of what waited back home. The government asked for sacrifice, and Americans delivered, but not without grumbling. Gasoline rationing meant fewer car rides, and many turned once again to bicycles, trolleys, or simply walking. Long lines for staples tested tempers. Black markets popped up, where butter or gasoline could be had for the right price, though most avoided them out of principle or fear. Rumors swirled constantly, about new weapons, about battles won or lost, about when it all might finally end. The uncertainty stretched nerves thin, yet hope was never fully extinguished. For soldiers overseas, letters were lifelines. A crumpled envelope could brighten an entire week. Men read them under lantern light, folded them carefully into breast pockets, and carried them into combat zones as charms. They were filled with ordinary details: what the neighbors were doing, how the garden was growing, the latest from the local baseball team, and those details mattered more than anyone back home could imagine. They reminded soldiers that the world of front porches and lemonade and laughter still existed, waiting for their return. As campaigns dragged on, the losses mounted, and grief touched nearly every family. Funeral services were held even when no body was present, with folded flags standing in for the absent. Communities rallied around widows, mothers, and children left behind, offering casseroles, comfort, and the promise that their loved one's sacrifice would not be forgotten. Yet behind closed doors, sorrow lingered. Some families never fully healed, carrying the weight long after victory parades had ended. Being American in those years meant living on a tightrope of emotions, fearful yet determined, weary yet resilient, grieving yet hopeful. It was not just about uniforms and battles, but about kitchens where coffee was stretched thin, about streets darkened for blackouts, about hearts waiting for footsteps on the porch. The war was fought in distant fields, but it was also fought in every American household, in every act of endurance, in every choice to believe that one day peace would return. By 1944, the war had stretched so long that many Americans scarcely remembered what peace felt like. The headlines had become part of daily life, and the rhythm of ration books and blackouts seemed normal, though no one ever truly grew used to them. Still, a shift was happening. The tide had begun to turn, and whispers of great offensives stirred both excitement and dread. People sensed that something monumental was building, even if they could not yet see its shape. For the soldiers in Europe, that turning point came with a single word: Normandy. The build-up to the invasion was a secret whispered in camps across England, though no one knew the exact day. Men drilled endlessly, practiced loading and unloading from landing craft, studied maps with beaches labeled in code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Letters home avoided details, but hints slipped through, as soldiers wrote of something big or important work ahead. The tension was palpable. When the morning of June 6th arrived, it was chaos and courage bound together. Imagine the roar of engines as planes droned overhead, the choppy waters of the channel filled with ships, the gray light of dawn breaking on the horizon. Young Americans, many barely out of their teens, clutched rifles and rosaries, seasick from the rough waves, hearts pounding. The ramps of landing craft splashed down, and suddenly they were wading into icy water, bullets snapping overhead, artillery thundering from the cliffs. Some never made it past the surf. Others crawled forward, stumbling across sand littered with obstacles and smoke. It was terror beyond words, yet it was also determination. The drive to push forward, 1 foot at a time, until the beach was theirs. Back home, news of D-Day spread quickly. Radios carried bulletins, newspapers ran bold headlines, and churches filled with people praying for sons, brothers, husbands. There was relief that the long-awaited invasion had begun, but also fear, because everyone understood the cost. Casualty lists soon confirmed what families already knew in their hearts. Victory would not come without sacrifice. Yet there was hope too, a sense that perhaps the war's end was closer than it had ever been. In the Pacific, the struggle was no less brutal. The strategy of island hopping demanded courage in the face of unimaginable hardship. Soldiers landed on tiny specks of land, fighting through jungles, caves, and cliffs, inching closer to Japan. Names like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima would burn themselves into memory. The fighting was relentless. Heat pressed down like a weight, ammunition grew scarce, and every cave might conceal an enemy willing to fight to the last breath. For Americans in those campaigns, survival meant grit, endurance, and an ability to keep moving forward when exhaustion begged them to stop. Those battles filtered back home through headlines and photographs. Families stared at grainy images of men raising flags, of ships bombarding shores, of weary faces staring into the camera. They tried to imagine what their loved ones were experiencing, though no imagination could capture it fully. They clipped articles, pasted them into scrapbooks, and carried the war in their hearts every day. The government urged Americans to keep pushing too. War bond drives grew larger, with Hollywood stars touring the country to sell bonds, urging audiences to back the attack. Citizens lined up to buy their share, filling theaters and town squares, cheering as celebrities spoke from stages. Victory Gardens produced millions of pounds of food, a quiet but essential contribution. Every can collected, every dollar saved, every hour worked was framed as another bullet, another tank, another step toward victory. Daily life remained marked by small sacrifices. Families stretched meals with fillers like oatmeal or breadcrumbs. Soap was scarce, nylon stockings nearly impossible to find, gasoline still rationed. People learned to improvise. Teenagers patched bicycles instead of buying new ones. Families reused jars until labels peeled away, and creative cooks experimented with recipes that would have seemed odd in earlier years. The slogan, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without," was not just a saying. It was a reality lived in every household. And yet, amid the shortages, there was celebration when good news arrived. Radio announcers spoke of Paris being liberated, and suddenly French flags waved alongside American ones in parades across the United States. Communities cheered, bells rang, and strangers embraced in the streets. For a brief moment, hope surged, filling towns and cities with the belief that the nightmare was finally beginning to end. But the war was not over. Soldiers marched deeper into Europe, discovering not only ruined cities but also the horrors hidden within concentration camps. The liberation of those camps revealed truths that few Americans had been prepared for: emaciated survivors, mass graves, cruelty that seemed beyond human imagination. Soldiers wrote home carefully, sparingly, unable to put into words what they had seen. Back in the States, newsreels and reports began to emerge, shocking a public that had not fully understood what the war was truly about. The fight was no longer only about borders or politics. It was about humanity itself. In the Pacific, the toll was equally heavy. Battles left beaches littered with wreckage, jungles scarred by fire, and survivors carrying memories that would never fade. The closer the fight moved to Japan, the fiercer the resistance grew. The war seemed endless, and every mile gained came at a staggering cost. For families at home, each new victory brought relief, but it was always tempered by the knowledge that thousands of young men would not return. To live as an American in those years was to balance between exhaustion and determination, between grief and resolve. You rose in the morning to go to work, to tend the garden, to line up for rations, while in the back of your mind you wondered if your loved one was safe. You listened to the radio at night, waiting for updates, sometimes clutching a letter that was already weeks old. And through it all, you held on to a vision of peace, of reunions, of streets filled with music instead of sirens. The war was turning, yes, but it was not yet finished. The heaviest battles still lay ahead, and America braced itself, ready to see it through no matter the cost that as 1945 approached. The world had already been reshaped by years of conflict, and for Americans, both overseas and at home, the sense of living through history was overwhelming. To be an American in those final months of the war was to carry exhaustion like a second skin, and yet also to feel a spark of determination that refused to die. Every headline seemed larger than life. Every rumor carried weight. Every letter mattered more than it should. In Europe, soldiers pushed across rivers and through ruined towns, each step bringing them closer to Berlin. The days were long, filled with marches that left feet blistered and bodies aching, with nights broken by the rumble of artillery and the whistle of shells. They learned to live in the rhythm of combat, moments of quiet that could shatter in an instant, laughter over a cigarette cut short by an order to move out. They scavenged for food when rations ran thin, traded with locals for eggs or bread, and sometimes sat down with families who had endured years of occupation, trying to bridge language with smiles, gestures, and the universal hunger for peace. For Americans at home, the war's end seemed tantalizingly near, but life was still dominated by sacrifice. The ration books remained, the blackouts continued, the posters urging vigilance stayed pasted to walls. Gasoline was still precious, meat still rare, sugar still measured carefully. People dreamed aloud of simple pleasures that had been missing for years, of butter on warm toast, of new tires for a car, of nylon stockings bought without a struggle. Soldiers dreamed of the same things, writing home that they longed for apple pie, for coffee brewed fresh on a quiet morning, for the feel of a rail bed instead of a bunk or the bare ground. News of Germany's collapse built slowly, like a storm on the horizon. The radio carried reports of bridges crossed, cities captured, allies closing in. The public followed the maps in newspapers, tracing arrows with fingers, imagining where their sons and brothers might be. Then suddenly the war in Europe was over. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, church bells rang across the country. Parades filled the streets, and strangers hugged and kissed in celebrations that seemed to erupt spontaneously in every city and town. Flags flew from windows, horns honked, music played late into the night. For one part of the war, at least, the nightmare was over. But for millions of Americans, relief was tempered by a sobering truth. The war in the Pacific still raged on. Men were still fighting on islands where the enemy refused to surrender, where every battle seemed to demand a staggering price. The victory celebrations at home were joyful, but they were also cautious, because everyone knew there were still sons and brothers to be brought back alive. For soldiers in the Pacific, those final months were perhaps the hardest of all. The fighting grew fiercer the closer they moved toward Japan. The battle for Iwo Jima was a brutal test of endurance. Volcanic ash clung to boots, caves hid defenders who seemed to vanish and reappear, and every yard of ground was fought for its staggering cost. Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, an image that would become one of the most iconic of the war. But the victory was bittersweet, purchased with lives that could never be replaced. Soon after came Okinawa, a struggle that lasted months, with kamikaze attacks raining down from the skies and fierce fighting on the ground. Soldiers lived through days that blurred together. Rain soaking uniforms, mud sucking at boots, exhaustion pressing down like a weight, fear always close at hand. At home, families followed the grim headlines. Newspapers carried lists of the fallen, and households marked the names of sons, nephews, neighbors, boys who had once played baseball in the street. Women who had worked long hours in factories or offices now also grieved in silence, holding photographs close at night, waiting for letters that sometimes never came. Children asked questions that parents struggled to answer, wondering why their fathers were still gone when everyone else was celebrating victory in Europe. In those months, the sense of unity that had carried Americans through the war grew even sharper. People understood that their sacrifices were not yet finished. War bond drives continued, communities gathered supplies, and radio broadcasts reminded everyone to stay vigilant. Even as people longed for normalcy, they endured a little longer because the men in the Pacific needed them to. Then came the news of a weapon unlike any the world had ever known. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was beyond comprehension, and within days, Japan surrendered. The war that had consumed the world for nearly 6 years was finally over. For Americans, the announcement brought a rush of emotion so strong it defies easy description. Relief, joy, sorrow, exhaustion, all mixed together. In the streets of New York, Times Square overflowed with people dancing, kissing, cheering, confetti falling from windows like snow. In small towns, parades formed on the spot, neighbors embraced, and families rushed to churches to give thanks. But in quiet living rooms, many simply sat with tears streaming down their faces, clutching photographs of loved ones who would never return, whispering prayers of gratitude that at least it was over. Being American at that moment meant knowing you had lived through something vast and terrible, something that had demanded everything from you. Your energy, your patience, your hope, sometimes even your heart. It meant looking forward with uncertainty, wondering how the world would change now, wondering how those who returned would fit back into lives that had moved on without them. And it meant holding tightly to the belief that the sacrifice had been worth it, that the peace bought with so much blood and struggle would last as the long campaigns dragged on. Another hidden struggle weighed on the soldiers of the Eastern Front. Beyond the battles, the mud, and the freezing winters, there was the constant test of endurance in daily existence. The supply lines were stretched thin, and while both sides boasted of vast armies, food and equipment were never sufficient. Soldiers would often march for days with little more than dry bread, or a watery soup made from whatever vegetables could be scavenged. Hunger dulled their thoughts, made their bodies heavy, and added to the exhaustion of endless marching. Water, too, was not always clean or safe. Streams and wells were often polluted by the retreating enemy or frozen solid in the deep winters. Drinking from melted snow became a necessity, though it left many men with stomach illnesses that weakened them further. Hygiene was almost impossible to maintain in the trenches and field camps. Lice, fleas, and disease spread quickly, and soldiers grew accustomed to itching skin and infected wounds that rarely healed properly. Sleep was another rare luxury. At the front lines, men often rested only a few hours at a time, with the sounds of artillery echoing through the night. The constant state of alertness meant that even in the safety of a dugout or a barn, true rest was hard to achieve. Fatigue became as much an enemy as the opposing army, dulling reflexes and breaking spirits. The seasons themselves were merciless. Summers brought swarms of mosquitoes and suffocating heat, while winters froze fingers to weapons and turned the earth into a barren sheet of ice. Uniforms and boots were often inadequate, leaving men with frostbite or soaked to the bone from endless rain and mud. Each season carried its own kind of punishment, and each demanded silent endurance. Yet through these hardships, there was also an unspoken camaraderie. Soldiers found comfort in sharing the same suffering, in passing a cigarette, or sharing a laugh over some fleeting absurdity in the midst of chaos. These small human moments were like fragile lights in the vast shadow of the war. Without them, the crushing weight of the front might have been too much to bear. Returning home after months or years abroad was a shock in ways few could have imagined. For soldiers, stepping off the transport ship or train into familiar streets did not erase the sights, smells, and sounds of combat that clung stubbornly to their memory. The air smelled differently, quieter, warmer perhaps, but every step was accompanied by echoes of distant gunfire, of mud and sweat, of comrades lost. The homes they had left behind were often the same, yet subtly changed. Neighborhoods shifted, new families moved in, businesses had evolved, and the streets carried a rhythm that had been foreign to them while they were away. Families greeted their returning soldiers with joy, relief, and sometimes a quiet tension. Mothers who had held the household together, fathers who had taken on new responsibilities, siblings who had grown in their absence. All were there, but relationships had subtly shifted. Soldiers often felt out of place, struggling to reconcile their experiences abroad with the domestic expectations at home. Children who had once clung to a parent now spoke more confidently. Parents who had managed fear and scarcity now looked at their sons with a mixture of pride and concern, and spouses had learned to run households, budgets, and even businesses while the men were away. Everyday routines took on new weight. Soldiers went shopping and were shocked by the abundance of food and goods they had long gone without. Butter, sugar, fresh meat, coffee. All of it seemed almost surreal after years of rationing. However, for many, the abundance was accompanied by an unexpected sense of guilt. While families and communities celebrated peace, many returning soldiers carried mental burdens that no amount of luxuries could erase. Some could not speak of what they had seen. Others tried to hide their tremors, their nightmares, or the difficulty of falling asleep without the constant vigilance that war had demanded. Life slowly resumed its rhythms. Neighborhoods began hosting barbecues and picnics, community dances flourished, and theaters played films celebrating both the victory abroad and the return to peace. But even these moments were tinged with a new awareness. Americans had lived through something vast and terrible, and ordinary life now required the patience to reintegrate the extraordinary into the mundane. Veterans shared stories in hushed tones over coffee, in bars or around family tables, but many held back the darkest memories, knowing that the world they had returned to could not fully comprehend them. Jobs were a significant concern. Millions of men returned to a civilian workforce that had been reshaped in their absence. Women who had held positions in factories, offices, and farms were now expected to step aside, or at least negotiate a new role. There were tensions and adjustments, moments of pride and frustration alike. Soldiers often found comfort in the physicality of work, repairing homes, cars, or tools, or learning new trades offered through programs like the GI Bill, which promised education, training, and a foothold in a peacetime economy that was booming but still competitive. Social life also transformed. Community gatherings were more than just entertainment, they were therapy. Street parties, parades, church events, and dances allowed people to reconnect, to release tension, and to celebrate survival. Music played a central role in healing. Swing and jazz, once the soundtrack of rationed and tense days, now carried the weight of nostalgia, laughter, and hope. Soldiers who had carried gramophones or small radios into trenches now played records in living rooms, sharing tunes with families that had endured without them. Meals were transformed into a ritual of normalcy and indulgence. After years of rationed meat, sugar, and dairy, families cooked in ways that seemed almost indulgent. Recipes once considered luxurious returned to tables. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes with real butter, pies laden with sugar and fruit. Eating together became more than sustenance. It was a ceremony of survival, a reminder that ordinary life could be reclaimed, and that the rhythm of daily routines was once again something to cherish. Even children understood the weight of this period. They had grown up in war, learned rationing, endured scarcity, and contributed to victory gardens and scrap drives. Their playtime reflected their experiences. They mimicked soldiers, pretended to distribute supplies, or recreated scenes from the newsreels that had educated and terrified them. The war had shaped an entire generation, teaching them resilience, resourcefulness, and an awareness of sacrifice at an age when others might still be oblivious to the broader world. Newsreels and newspapers continued to dominate cultural conversation, not because the war was ongoing, but because people tried to contextualize what had happened. Stories of heroism, hardship, and survival were printed, broadcast, and recounted endlessly. Veterans, civilians, and even children absorbed these narratives, incorporating them into the collective memory that would define the post-war era. Commemorations, monuments, and memorials began appearing, formalizing grief and pride into tangible structures, ensuring that the past remained present in the daily consciousness of every American. To be American in this period meant to carry dual identities: the ordinary life of grocery shopping, family dinners, and work schedules, and the extraordinary experience of living through one of the deadliest and most transformative conflicts in human history. It meant walking through familiar streets with the weight of memories that no one else could fully understand. It meant celebrating abundance while mourning losses. It meant honoring sacrifice while trying to reclaim a sense of peace. And above all, it meant learning to balance hope, grief, and resilience in a world that had changed forever. The streets hummed with a quiet kind of tension, even after the guns had fallen silent. Men and women moved with a rhythm that was both familiar and changed, carrying the weight of years that had felt much longer. Stores filled with shelves that had once been bare, yet shoppers moved carefully, still accustomed to checking ration books, still pausing to compare prices or measure sugar and butter. There was excitement in abundance, but it was laced with an awareness of what had been endured to reach this moment. Returning soldiers found themselves navigating spaces that seemed the same but carried echoes of absence. Neighbors who had once waved from porches now seemed older, children taller than remembered, gardens fuller, and streets busier. The flow of ordinary life was comforting in some ways, yet jarring in others, because the experiences carried home could not be left at the doorstep. Some men found that their friends, untouched by combat, struggled to understand why a laugh could sometimes feel hollow, why the quietest moment might trigger memory of a battlefield, why sleep sometimes refused them. Work offered both distraction and grounding. Factories shifted from producing tanks and rifles to cars and appliances, and the skills soldiers had learned abroad, or in domestic war efforts, often translated into new opportunities. Men repaired buildings, machines, and vehicles, or returned to farms that had grown under their absence. The GI Bill opened classrooms to those who wanted education, and universities swelled with returning veterans seeking knowledge they had put off for the sake of survival. Yet even as they learned, there was a constant balancing act between ambition and memory, between the desire to move forward and the pull of what had been seen and endured. In homes, the landscape of relationships had shifted. Wives and mothers who had shouldered unprecedented responsibilities during the war sometimes found it difficult to step aside, or to see men who had been away for years slip back into domestic routines. Household roles were renegotiated, conversations cautiously tested boundaries, and new patterns of authority and cooperation emerged. Children who had matured through necessity were eager to assert independence, and families learned anew how to navigate the tension between the past and the present. Community life had its own pulse. Town halls and churches became spaces for storytelling and remembrance. Veterans spoke in measured tones, recounting the extraordinary within the ordinary. The smell of baked bread in a liberated village, the songs hummed in trenches, the quiet courage of a comrade holding a cigarette to share a fleeting moment of peace. Neighborhood gatherings often included potluck dinners, music and dances that were part celebration, part therapy. Every event carried a sense of reconnection, an attempt to knit the threads of disrupted lives back together. Cultural shifts emerged slowly but inevitably. Music, once a background to wartime rationing and dances, now became a soundtrack for freedom and hope. Swing and jazz filled ballrooms, radios, and living rooms, and the rhythm seemed to carry away tension for at least a few hours at a time. Hollywood films, once focused on propaganda and morale, shifted to stories of romance, adventure, and humor, providing an escape and a sense of continuity in the everyday. People read books, newspapers, and magazines voraciously, seeking information about the world that had changed while they had fought or waited. Meals became a celebration of survival. Families experimented with recipes that had once been considered extravagant, combining butter, sugar, meat, and fresh vegetables in ways that had been impossible during rationing. Sunday dinners became almost ritualistic, a chance to gather, to share stories, to laugh, to remember, and to imagine the future. Even simple breakfasts, coffee poured from fresh beans, toast spread thick with butter, felt imbued with the meaning of regained normalcy. Yet beneath all this, there was a quiet reckoning. Veterans sometimes found themselves staring at empty chairs, remembering friends who would never return. They kept letters folded carefully, photographs worn at the edges, and mementos of distant lands tucked in drawers. The memories of combat, of hunger, of cold, and of fear persisted, shaping the way they moved, spoke, and dreamed. Many struggled with sleep, with fits of anger, with sudden bursts of emotion that caught family and friends unprepared. The world had changed, and they had changed with it, carrying the invisible scars that the public could not always see. Even children absorbed echoes of the war. Their games, their stories, and their understanding of heroism reflected what they had witnessed from the sidelines. Schoolrooms often incorporated lessons on geography, history, and civics framed by wartime experience. Playgrounds became stages for mimicked battles, imagined heroism, and the enactment of courage in miniature, safe forms. In these ways, the war's reach extended beyond those who had served directly, shaping an entire generation's understanding of resilience, sacrifice, and identity. To be American in this era was to balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between relief and mourning, between hope and the deep awareness that the world had changed irrevocably. It was a life punctuated by small victories, shared laughter, a full meal, a letter returned, a night of unbroken sleep, and enormous losses that could never be undone. Every step, every conversation, every quiet moment carried the weight of the war and the hope for a future where such darkness might never return. Even as cities and towns adjusted to the return of soldiers, the transformation of daily life continued quietly but profoundly. Streets that had once been dark during blackouts now glowed with streetlights, and store windows displayed goods that had been unimaginable just years before. People stepped outside with a renewed curiosity, noticing details they had ignored while ration books and curfews governed their existence. Cars lined the streets again, children played freely, and the hum of ordinary life was accompanied by a subtle, shared relief that danger was no longer immediate, though memory lingered. Workers returned to factories and offices that had operated under wartime constraints, yet the atmosphere had shifted. Where once the pace had been dictated by urgency and rationing, now there was space for reflection, for slower, more deliberate labor. Veterans carried skills learned under extreme circumstances: precision, adaptability, and the ability to improvise under pressure. These skills translated into post-war productivity, but also into a quiet pride and sometimes a sense of restlessness. They had been trained to act decisively under threat, and peacetime routines occasionally felt monotonous, even stifling. Social life expanded, yet remained tinged with the weight of recent years. Community halls, parks, and churches hosted dances and gatherings designed to reconnect families and neighbors. Men who had returned from combat often moved cautiously among crowds, careful not to expose the tension that still ran beneath the surface. Women, who had managed households, farms, and factories during the war, were now navigating both the return of husbands and the continuation of their own responsibilities. Children, meanwhile, absorbed the rhythms of this transitional period, learning from parents, observing neighbors, and finding play in ways that combined imagination with echoes of the conflict they had lived alongside. Music and entertainment flourished as a salve to collective anxiety. Swing, jazz, and the beginnings of rhythm and blues filled dance halls and radios alike. Movies offered both escapism and reassurance, telling stories of triumph, humor, and romance in worlds that felt safer and more ordered than the one that had existed a few months prior. Citizens flocked to cinemas, not only for entertainment but for a sense of connection, a shared understanding that life was slowly returning to its natural rhythms. Food became a quiet symbol of both victory and resilience. Families experimented with recipes that had been impossible under rationing, combining ingredients that had once been reserved or scarce. Kitchens became theaters of creativity, and shared meals carried a heightened significance. Sunday dinners, once simple affairs, transformed into communal rituals celebrating survival and continuity. Bread, butter, sugar, and meat, all restored to the table, were no longer just sustenance but a tangible marker of what had been regained. Yet shadows lingered. Veterans often struggled with memories that returned unexpectedly. Sounds, smells, or sights that transported them instantly back to distant battlefields. Families learned to navigate these moments with patience, understanding, or silence. Some men joined veteran organizations to seek camaraderie, sharing experiences and advice with those who understood without explanation. Letters and photographs became sacred objects, reminders of both lost comrades and loved ones who had waited faithfully at home. Education shifted as well. Schools incorporated wartime experiences into curriculum, not only in history classes but through civic education, teaching the younger generation about responsibility, sacrifice, and the fragility of peace. Students who had spent years contributing to war efforts, through scrap drives, ration collection, or community support, now saw their efforts acknowledged formally, reinforcing a collective understanding that everyone, even children, had played a part in the nation's endurance. Travel, once restricted by fuel rationing and limited resources, began to expand slowly. Families took trips by train, bus, or car, experiencing landscapes untouched by bombings and battles. Parks, beaches, and countryside retreats became sites of tentative joy, moments of play and freedom that contrasted sharply with memories of scarcity and vigilance. Vacationing was not merely leisure. It was a reclamation of time, a way to mark the boundary between survival and living fully again. Communities found ways to commemorate the war even as life moved forward. Monuments, plaques, and memorial services became regular fixtures, honoring those who had fought and died. Parades and ceremonies offered spaces for collective memory, blending mourning with celebration. Every plaque and every story passed along in conversation reinforced the idea that life had been tested, endured, and that survival was a privilege intertwined with responsibility. Being an American in this post-war moment meant living with dual awareness, an intimate understanding of what the world had been and a cautious hope for what it could become. Every meal, conversation, and stroll down the street carried both nostalgia and forward-looking optimism. Every family gathering was shaded by memories of absence, courage, and endurance, and every ordinary act, pouring a cup of coffee, walking the dog, reading a newspaper, was infused with the quiet triumph of having survived, of having witnessed history, and of carrying both its burdens and its lessons into the next chapter of life. Even in moments of celebration, there was a subtle undercurrent of reflection. Streets filled with laughter and music, yet some faces in the crowd carried shadows of what had been endured. Veterans walked among neighbors, still feeling the imprint of distant battles on their posture, their movements, even their expressions. Ordinary tasks, buying groceries, walking to work, paying bills, were approached with a quiet determination, a sense that every small act mattered because it represented survival, resilience, and continuity. The home front continued to evolve. Women, who had become adept at managing households, jobs, and communities, now navigated the reintegration of men who had been away for years. Some adjusted seamlessly, while others discovered tension in roles that had been redefined by necessity. Families negotiated new patterns of cooperation, blending the old and the new, often through trial and error, learning to accommodate both past experiences and present expectations. Children observed these shifts closely, noticing how parents laughed, argued, and celebrated in ways that subtly reflected the war's impact. Entertainment played a central role in restoring a sense of normalcy. Dance halls, cinemas, and music clubs thrived, offering spaces where people could immerse themselves in rhythm, movement, and laughter. Swing and jazz provided a soundtrack to freedom, while Hollywood films transported viewers into worlds of romance, comedy, and adventure, offering both distraction and reassurance. Newspapers carried stories of the war's conclusion, heroism, and survival, reinforcing the collective memory of what had been endured and shaping the culture of gratitude, pride, and cautious optimism. Food, once rationed and carefully measured, became a symbol of regained abundance. Kitchens returned to full operation, and families experimented with recipes that had been impossible during the war. Roast meats, fresh vegetables, pies, and desserts reappeared on tables, transforming meals into shared rituals of comfort and celebration. Every bite reminded people of endurance, creativity, and the small joys of ordinary life. Sunday dinners, once simple, became opportunities to recount stories, share laughter, and strengthen family bonds. The return to work was equally transformative. Factories shifted from producing wartime materials to consumer goods, and veterans brought with them skills learned under intense circumstances: adaptability, precision, and problem-solving. These abilities contributed to a surge in post-war productivity, while also allowing men to find purpose and regain control over their lives. Some pursued higher education under the GI Bill, learning trades or professions that promised stability and opportunity, while others returned to familiar jobs with new perspectives shaped by years of extraordinary experience. Travel and leisure slowly expanded, offering Americans opportunities to reclaim time and explore spaces untouched by wartime scarcity. Train trips, family vacations, and weekend excursions became methods of reconnecting with the world. Parks, beaches, and countryside retreats provided relief from the routines of post-war adjustment, spaces where people could breathe, reflect, and simply exist without the constant tension of scarcity or danger. These journeys, both short and long, were more than recreation. They were acts of restoration, reminders that life could once again contain freedom, exploration, and discovery. Communities embraced remembrance alongside celebration. Monuments, plaques, and memorial ceremonies became central to social life, honoring those who had fought, died, or contributed on the home front. These rituals, blending mourning and pride, allowed families and neighbors to process collective grief and reaffirm the value of survival. Conversations over coffee or at town meetings often included reminiscences of small acts of courage, tales of endurance, and observations on the resilience required to navigate life under extraordinary circumstances. Education for children and young adults integrated lessons from the war. Geography, history, and civics classes included discussions of sacrifice, responsibility, and the fragility of peace. Students who had participated in war-related efforts, scrap drives, ration monitoring, volunteer work, saw their contributions acknowledged, reinforcing a sense of belonging to a nation that had endured hardship collectively. These lessons extended beyond the classroom, influencing social interactions, hobbies, and imaginative play, helping a generation understand resilience and collective effort. Mental and emotional adaptation remained ongoing. Veterans, even years after returning, occasionally wrestled with memories that resurfaced unbidden. Sounds, smells, or sensations that transported them instantly to distant battlefields. Families learned to recognize these triggers and respond with patience, understanding, and quiet support. Support networks, social clubs, and veteran organizations provided spaces to share experiences, exchange advice, and build camaraderie, reinforcing that the bonds formed during wartime often endured well into peacetime. Being American during this post-war period meant navigating a delicate balance between past and present. Every act, from pouring a cup of coffee to attending a dance, carried a dual awareness of what had been endured and what was now possible. Ordinary life was both celebration and adjustment, joy and remembrance, relief and reflection. The war had transformed individuals, families, and communities, leaving indelible marks that shaped how people moved, worked, laughed, and dreamed. And through it all, there was a persistent, quiet determination to move forward, to rebuild, and to live fully in the world that had been hard-won through sacrifice, endurance, and resilience. Even as streets filled with the sounds of commerce and children's laughter, there was an invisible rhythm that governed daily life, shaped by years of tension, scarcity, and vigilance. Families moved through routines with heightened awareness, each step a reminder of what had been endured. Kitchens, once sites of strict rationing and careful measurement, now became arenas of experimentation and joy. Women who had mastered the art of stretching ingredients found delight in combining butter, fresh milk, and sugar in ways that had been forbidden just months before. Recipes were shared between neighbors, whispered over fences, or exchanged during Sunday visits, creating a quiet network of culinary celebration that reinforced both community and resilience. Music continued to be a lifeline. Radios filled homes with swing, jazz, and the earliest strains of rhythm and blues, and phonographs spun records that transported listeners far from mundane streets and routines. Soldiers who had carried small radios into trenches now played these same songs in living rooms, their notes acting as both therapy and a bridge between the past and the present. Even children absorbed the rhythms, tapping fingers and feet to melodies that carried the pulse of a world rediscovering itself. Social gatherings became more than entertainment. They were mechanisms for emotional recalibration. Neighborhood dances, church socials, and community picnics allowed people to share joy, laughter, and even grief in a collective setting. Veterans, moving cautiously among crowds, sometimes found themselves drawn into conversation with strangers who had never seen a battlefield but understood endurance, sacrifice, and survival in their own ways. These gatherings forged connections that extended beyond immediate families, linking individuals into networks of empathy and shared history. Workplaces evolved, too. Factories that once produced military equipment shifted to consumer goods, and veterans found that skills honed under extreme pressure. Problem-solving, improvisation, precision translated into remarkable productivity. Men repaired machinery, rebuilt infrastructure, and learned new trades. Education programs, particularly those offered under the GI Bill, enabled veterans to pursue professions that had been impossible before the war. Universities and technical schools expanded, accommodating the influx of returning soldiers seeking stability and purpose. There was a sense that learning, work, and productivity were no longer purely functional. They were acts of reclamation, statements that life could be rebuilt and reshaped. Travel slowly regained its appeal. Families ventured beyond their hometowns, exploring parks, beaches, and rural landscapes that had been inaccessible or unvisited during wartime. Train trips and automobile excursions provided both freedom and perspective, allowing Americans to reclaim space and time that had been constrained by rationing and war. The act of moving through landscapes, noticing hills, rivers, forests, and small towns, carried with it a subtle therapy. The ability to witness continuity in the natural and built environment even as personal and collective lives had been transformed. Children played with awareness of both imagination and reality. Games often mirrored wartime experiences, reenacting battles or mimicking rescue efforts, while also incorporating humor and creativity to soften the harsh lessons they had absorbed. Schoolrooms emphasized geography, civics, and history in ways that reinforced collective responsibility, but also encouraged reflection, critical thinking, and empathy. Children learned early that survival was not only about courage in extraordinary circumstances, but also about the quiet endurance of daily life. Evenings were often spent in quiet reflection. Families gathered around radios, listening to broadcasts that recounted victories, shared stories, or introduced new music. Letters and photographs continued to act as anchors to memory, reminders of both loss and perseverance. Veterans sometimes lingered over mementos of distant towns, of comrades, or of moments too small to enter official history, yet indelibly imprinted on their own experience. These rituals, however private, maintained continuity between wartime and peacetime, between extraordinary experience and ordinary existence. Mental and emotional adjustment remained ongoing. The pressure to reintegrate, to reconcile extraordinary experience with ordinary life, created challenges that often required patience, understanding, and external support. Veteran organizations, community clubs, and informal networks of peers provided spaces to share, learn, and endure together. In these gatherings, stories unfolded in layers of bravery, absurdity, hunger, humor, and fear, and collectively, they helped individuals navigate the complex terrain of post-war existence. Cultural identity was being reshaped. Americans understood themselves differently, no longer merely as citizens, but as survivors, witnesses, and participants in one of the largest conflicts in history. Ordinary life, shopping, commuting, attending church, or walking in a park, carried layers of meaning, acting as both assertion of normalcy and reminder of endurance. Every small act, from lighting a cigarette to sipping coffee, became a gesture of reclaimed autonomy, a quiet acknowledgement that life could continue, even flourish, after extraordinary trials. To be American in this period was to inhabit dual realities, one anchored in memory, sacrifice, and endurance, the other in hope, reconstruction, and exploration of the possibilities of peace. Every street, every kitchen, every schoolroom, every dance hall was charged with the weight of history, yet infused with the energy of those determined to move forward. And in this delicate balance, life flowed, sometimes cautiously, sometimes exuberantly, but always with the recognition that ordinary days, laughter, meals, and music were victories in themselves. In quiet moments, Americans began noticing the subtle transformations in neighborhoods, streets, and public spaces. Stores, once stripped bare by rationing, now displayed shelves overflowing with canned goods, fabrics, and small luxuries. Even window displays seemed to hum with new life, showcasing household items, clothing, and toys that had been impossible to obtain during wartime. Walking down these streets, citizens often felt a mixture of relief and disbelief, their senses attuned both to abundance and to the invisible echoes of scarcity that still lingered in memory. At home, routines were both restored and reinvented. Kitchens became laboratories of experimentation, with families trying out new recipes and rediscovering old favorites. The smell of fresh bread, sizzling meat, and baked desserts filled rooms in a way that had been rare or impossible for years. Women, who had mastered the art of rationing, now delighted in the ability to cook freely, swapping tips with neighbors and experimenting with ingredients previously unavailable. Even small acts, like buttering toast or pouring a cup of coffee, carried a new weight, a sense of reclaimed normalcy that had been postponed for too long. Music continued to shape the rhythm of daily life. Radios blared swing, jazz, and the early strains of rhythm and blues, creating a soundtrack for both work and leisure. Soldiers who had once carried small radios through trenches now played the same songs at home, sharing rhythms that had carried them through fear, mud, and exhaustion. Children tapped along to melodies, learning without consciously realizing how music had bridged past and present, trauma and recovery. Even community dances incorporated these sounds, providing a social mechanism to reconnect, to celebrate survival, and to heal collectively. Leisure and social life flourished in ways both small and large. Neighborhood parks became gathering points for families, with children playing games that combined imagination and lessons from wartime experience. Baseball games, picnics, and simple walks became avenues for reconnecting with the rhythm of ordinary life. Churches and community centers hosted socials, dances, and meetings where conversations ranged from shared memories of the war to practical advice on rebuilding homes, finances, and daily routines. Each gathering reinforced bonds and provided subtle therapy, a communal way to process the weight of experience while celebrating the safety of the present. Work became a marker of both continuity and change. Factories that had produced tanks and munitions shifted to consumer goods, and veterans brought skills learned under extraordinary pressure. Adaptability, problem-solving, and precision. Men repaired machinery, rebuilt infrastructure, and trained in new trades. The GI Bill offered educational opportunities that expanded professional horizons, giving many a chance to move beyond the limitations imposed by years of conflict. Yet even in these successes, there was a quiet awareness of past hardship, a recognition that productivity and stability were not merely functional but acts of resilience. Travel expanded cautiously. Families took road trips, train journeys, and visits to natural spaces that had previously been inaccessible. Beaches, forests, and countryside retreats became sites of play, reflection, and escape from the pressures of rebuilding. These excursions, simple by modern standards, carried an emotional weight, a reminder of freedom regained, a contrast to years of scarcity, vigilance, and fear. Even short journeys, to visit neighbors or relatives, felt like small victories, affirming the gradual reclamation of ordinary life. Children absorbed the new rhythms of peace with curiosity and adaptability. Their play reflected both imagination and the lessons of wartime life. Games sometimes mirrored distant battles, supply missions, or acts of rescue, but humor, creativity, and ingenuity always softened these reenactments. In schools, geography, history, and civics were infused with lessons about responsibility, sacrifice, and collective effort, reinforcing the awareness that survival was not only about individual courage, but also about cooperation, foresight, and community. Mental and emotional adjustment remained a continuous undercurrent. Veterans sometimes experienced flashbacks triggered by sounds, smells, or tactile memories, while families learned to respond with patience, understanding, and silence when necessary. Social clubs and veteran organizations provided spaces for storytelling, camaraderie, and informal therapy. Conversations there mixed heroism, absurdity, hunger, fear, and humor, creating layered narratives that helped participants navigate both memory and reintegration. Cultural identity evolved subtly yet persistently. Americans understood themselves as survivors, participants, and witnesses, inhabiting dual realities. The ordinary routines of home, work, and leisure, and the extraordinary experiences of war, loss, and resilience. Every small act, pouring a cup of coffee, attending a dance, or repairing a fence, became a gesture of continuity, a statement that life had not only survived but could flourish. Streets, kitchens, schools, and parks were infused with meaning, balancing joy, caution, and hope in a delicate harmony that defined post-war life. Being American during this period meant carrying history in every gesture, memory, and interaction. Each ordinary moment was layered with significance, echoing the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped it. Meals, music, walks, and conversations were both celebrations of survival and acknowledgments of endurance. Life flowed with the recognition that ordinary days, laughter, and shared experiences were not trivial. They were victories, markers of resilience, and foundations for the future. Even ordinary mornings carried a peculiar blend of novelty and memory. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon traveled across kitchens and backyards, mingling with the faint hum of city streets slowly awakening from years of scarcity. Windows flung open, letting in air that seemed cleaner, brighter, almost celebratory. Yet every glance at a neighbor's lawn or storefront carried subtle awareness of what had been endured. Children ran barefoot on sidewalks, their laughter punctuating the rhythm of streets that were no longer constrained by rationing or blackouts, and adults paused in fleeting reflection, noticing how life could feel both familiar and unrecognizable. Workplaces, whether factories, farms, or offices, had transformed quietly but decisively. Men who had returned from the front lines carried not only the skills acquired in battle, precision, timing, improvisation, but also an uncanny sense of patience and observation. Women who had stepped into roles traditionally held by men navigated the delicate balance between retaining independence and reintegrating returning family members into household and professional routines. Colleagues shared small stories over lunch or tea, blending humor with the occasional shadow of loss, creating an invisible network of understanding that shaped the culture of post-war work. Evenings introduced another layer of subtle reconstruction. Radios filled rooms with familiar melodies, and the first crackle of swing or jazz created a bridge between wartime memories and present leisure. Dishes were washed slowly, sometimes forgotten for a few minutes while families lingered at the table, discussing the news or recounting small adventures from the day. In neighborhoods, streetlights reflected off freshly washed cars, children's shadows danced on pavements, and the occasional neighbor called across the fence to share a recipe tip, a piece of gossip, or simply a moment of camaraderie that reinforced community bonds. Travel began in measured increments. Families ventured to nearby towns, beaches, or lakes, exploring spaces that had previously been inaccessible. Automobiles, once rationed, scarce, or repurposed for military use, now carried entire families on weekends, loaded with picnic baskets and blankets. Even short trips carried an emotional weight. The first bite of a sandwich beside a quiet lake, the gentle sway of a train car passing through familiar farmland, the warmth of sunlight on a porch far from wartime worries. Each journey was a quiet act of reclamation, a reaffirmation that ordinary life could be expansive, joyful, and, importantly, safe. Children, resilient as ever, absorbed these shifts with a combination of curiosity, creativity, and mimicry. Play often mirrored adult experiences in subtle ways. Games involved organizing imaginary supplies, rescuing dolls or pets, or recreating heroic feats seen in newsreels and films. Laughter and ingenuity softened these reenactments, making them both educational and therapeutic. Schools reinforced these lessons, integrating geography, history, and civics into curricula that emphasized responsibility, community, and the awareness that even small contributions mattered. Social gatherings remained essential. Picnics, block parties, and church socials created spaces for communal reflection, entertainment, and reconciliation. Stories of survival and heroism were shared in casual tones, interspersed with jokes, humorous anecdotes, and quiet admissions of fear. Veterans often found solace in these conversations, recognizing themselves in the experiences of others, while families discovered subtle ways to rebuild bonds strained by absence and uncertainty. Even routine social visits carried a new weight, a recognition that presence itself was now meaningful and rare. Meals became symbolic anchors. Kitchens were alive with activity, the clatter of pots and pans mingling with conversation. Ingredients once restricted, fresh vegetables, meat, butter, sugar, were celebrated, prepared with care, and shared generously. Sunday dinners became moments of ritualistic reflection, storytelling, and laughter, a way for families to claim normalcy while acknowledging what had been endured. Even small gestures, like pouring milk over cereal or buttering bread, carried the subtle significance of reclaimed stability and hope. Mental adjustment remained continuous. Veterans grappled with memories that resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by sounds, smells, or sensations. Families learned to respond with patience, creating silent spaces of support when necessary. Social clubs, local organizations, and informal networks allowed people to share experiences, exchange advice, and build camaraderie, creating communities that were both therapeutic and socially cohesive. These gatherings often balanced humor and tragedy, creating narratives that allowed collective endurance to translate into resilience and adaptation. Cultural identity was constantly evolving. Americans navigated dual realities, one informed by extraordinary experiences of war and loss, and the other by ordinary life that demanded attention, energy, and care. Every street corner, every schoolyard, every kitchen and park bench carried echoes of both past struggle and present promise. Ordinary acts, sweeping a porch, playing with a child, preparing a meal, were infused with meaning, subtle yet powerful, demonstrating that survival and joy were inseparable. Being American during this period meant inhabiting a world that balanced memory, reflection, and possibility. Every laugh, every conversation, every shared meal was charged with significance, blending ordinary routines with extraordinary awareness. Life moved forward in a delicate rhythm, acknowledging loss while celebrating regained freedom, reinforcing the sense that ordinary days themselves were acts of quiet triumph. Evenings often carried a quiet hum of activity that blurred the lines between work, leisure, and reflection. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting elongated shadows across sidewalks where children had spent the late afternoon playing games borrowed from both imagination and the remnants of wartime experience. Adults moved through kitchens, living rooms, and porches, attending to daily chores but also engaging in conversations that balanced humor, observation, and subtle reflection on what had been endured. A simple walk down the block could reveal neighbors exchanging recipes, small news items, or brief anecdotes of shared struggle, creating a rhythm of connection that was both ordinary and deeply meaningful. Factories and workplaces continued to evolve, blending the knowledge and skills acquired during wartime with the demands of a peacetime economy. Veterans who had been trained to adapt quickly to changing conditions brought a meticulous attention to detail and problem-solving capacity that reshaped production lines. Women who had occupied critical roles during the war continued to assert independence and competence, creating a subtle tension that sometimes required negotiation, but more often generated new forms of collaboration. Lunch breaks and informal gatherings at work became spaces for storytelling, laughter, and sharing observations, a way of processing experiences while maintaining productivity. Music filled homes, radios, and dance halls with a vitality that reminded everyone of both resilience and joy. Swing, jazz, and the early strains of rhythm and blues provided a soundtrack to the everyday, helping bridge memories of conflict with the present. Soldiers who had once carried small radios through trenches now shared records and songs with friends and family, passing on melodies that had offered comfort and connection in moments of fear or uncertainty. Children, whether listening or learning to tap rhythms with their feet, absorbed these patterns as part of their own understanding of freedom and creativity. Social gatherings increasingly became hubs for subtle therapy and community building. Neighborhood picnics, block parties, and church socials allowed people to share stories, humor, and practical advice, often blending the extraordinary with the mundane. Veterans found solace in these interactions, discovering that shared experiences, even casually recounted, provided validation and understanding. Families used these gatherings to negotiate shifting household roles, reconcile absences, and strengthen emotional bonds. Even minor interactions, a wave across the street, an exchanged smile, a whispered comment, helped reconstruct a social fabric stretched thin by years of disruption. Meals remained symbolic, embedding ordinary acts with extraordinary significance. Kitchens buzzed with activity, from chopping vegetables to stirring sauces, while the aroma of fresh bread, baked desserts, and sizzling meats filled the home. Recipes once considered indulgent or impossible now became routine, shared with neighbors or reinvented according to taste. Sunday dinners served as anchors, occasions where families gathered to recount stories, share laughter, and reflect on survival. Simple gestures, pouring milk, buttering bread, arranging plates, carried subtle reminders that life had been reclaimed and normalized, if only in the small details of domestic routine. Travel, though still measured, became an emblem of freedom. Families ventured on short trips to nearby lakes, parks, and small towns, enjoying landscapes untouched by wartime scarcity. Cars and trains became conduits for both discovery and reflection, providing physical and psychological distance from the routines of post-war adjustment. Even brief excursions offered moments of joy, conversation, and shared experience, helping individuals reclaim both mobility and imagination that had been restricted during wartime. Children's play mirrored adult life, blending imagination with lessons absorbed from wartime reality. Games involved supply missions, heroic rescues, or improvised adventure, but were softened by humor, creativity, and social learning. Schools integrated these lessons with geography, civics, and history, reinforcing ideas of responsibility, cooperation, and the significance of collective action. Playgrounds became sites of both education and therapy, spaces where ordinary interactions helped process extraordinary experiences, shaping a generation that learned resilience by living it in miniature form. Mental and emotional adaptation remained ongoing. Veterans navigated memories that returned unbidden, triggered by sounds, smells, or visual cues. Families responded with patience and understanding, creating small rituals of support and acknowledgement. Social clubs, local organizations, and informal networks facilitated storytelling and camaraderie, where humor, tragedy, and shared insight created layered narratives of endurance. These spaces allowed veterans and families alike to balance memory and reintegration, finding stability and expression in communal experience. Cultural identity continued to shift subtly, blending past and present. Americans inhabited dual realities, one informed by the extraordinary experiences of war, the other shaped by ordinary life and domestic responsibilities. Every kitchen, street, schoolroom, and park became charged with meaning. Ordinary acts, washing dishes, sweeping porches, playing games, or attending dances, were imbued with subtle significance, evidence that survival and joy were inseparable. Life progressed in a rhythm both delicate and resilient, celebrating ordinary victories while acknowledging the weight of memory. Being American during this era meant recognizing that daily routines, laughter, meals, and small social interactions were acts of quiet triumph. The rhythm of ordinary life carried echoes of endurance, courage, and collective survival, blending seamlessly with hope, creativity, and the slow reconstruction of post-war society. Every moment, no matter how seemingly mundane, was layered with the significance of experience, continuity, and the human capacity to rebuild, enjoy, and endure.